Hello to our panelists. Thank you all for getting logged in and getting set up. If you could do one quick thing for us so that our media attendees can identify you, to put your name and your organization in your name on the Newswise thing. So to do that, if you go to the little upper right corner of your own image, there's a little 3-dot menu that has an option to rename. And so if you could just put your first name, last name, and where you're from, that would be great. And we'll be asking the media to do the same. If any of our media attendees are logged in, we ask that you do the same thing that I'm asking our panelists to do. That way we can identify the media members who'd like to ask questions and know who you are and what outlet you're from. And again, up in the upper corner, little 3-dot menu, under that menu, rename, and then type first name, last name, and where you're from. We do have one more panelist who should be getting logged in and joining us here shortly. And I'll be making those announcements probably a couple times before we get started. John, could you enable your audio real quick? I want to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly. Could you say your name for me?
Wilczynski.
Wilczynski. Got it. Great. John, I got your link. I'll chat that later on when we're talking about that. Thank you. For media who are getting logged in, thank you for joining us. We'd like to ask that you please identify yourself, as we're going to be taking questions from media, and we want to know your name and the outlet that you're from. To do that, if you hover over your own image in the video chat, and up in the upper corner, there's a little menu with 3 dots that you click on, and under that menu, there's an option to rename. And if you could just make sure to add what outlet you're from, e.g., Ron Burgundy, Channel 4 News Team, and that will help us to identify you when we are taking questions. We'll also invite media to ask questions themselves. This is an interactive medium. If you're on audio and or camera, we'd welcome for you to ask questions yourself. If not, if you're not comfortable with that, you can just chat them and we'll ask them for you. We'll be getting started in maybe 4 or 5 minutes, giving time for everyone who's registered to get logged in. And we are waiting on one more of our experts who's on the panel. And I'll repeat those announcements a couple more times before we get started. So thanks for your patience and bear with us. And here's our final panelist getting logged in. Professor Farmer, if you could just check your audio for me once you get connected. Are you able to hear us, Professor Farmer?
I hear you fine.
Okay, excellent. I just want to ask you real quick, I want to make sure I pronounce your first name correctly. Could you tell me how to say it?
Doyne.
Doyne.
Hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I respond to anything, but I appreciate your getting away.
We will get started in just a couple of minutes, and we want to make sure that all of our attendees, especially those in the media, if you could please rename yourself so that we know where you're from, as well as our panelists too. Professor Farmer, if you could make sure to
Yeah.
rename yourself and add
Right, I
your
will.
university name.
Right.
I'm curious about the origin of the name Doyne, Professor Farmer. Where is it from?
Well, it's from my grandmother from Arkansas, but I use the family legend. It was Welsh, but actually I've figured out since being over here, it's Irish.
That was kind of my hunch. That's very interesting.
Good.
Very cool. Please, everyone, if you can, rename yourself so we can identify you. For media who are getting logged in, we're going to give a couple more minutes as the people registered trickle in. Please make sure to indicate your media outlet so that when we take your questions via the chat, that we can identify who you are. So hover over your own window, your own video, and in the upper corner, there's a little menu for a 3-dot menu for more options. And under that is an option to click rename, and you can type your name in there. And we suggest first name, last name, and your media outlet. As I've said, my example, Ron Burgundy, Channel 4 News Team. That way we can tell who you are and where you're from. And we'd love to invite media to ask their own questions. So chat to us that you have a question and what your question is, and we'll ask you if you'd like to go ahead and ask it live to the panel. If you're not comfortable with that, we can go ahead and just ask them for you. So I have several questions for each of our panelists that we'll do to get started. We'll take questions from media throughout the meeting, and any of the media who would like to go ahead and get on video and audio to ask your questions, you are more than welcome to do so. And we are going to be just getting straight into questions. We don't do any kind of presentations or PowerPoints or anything like that. We just get straight into conversation and Q&A. So any media who do have questions, feel free to send them in right away. Of course, it may help as you hear some of the experts talk with some of the questions we have prepared. It might give you a better idea of some of the questions that you have. But by all means, please do send those questions in as early in the process as you'd like, as soon as you think of any questions. And we'll get started in just another minute or two. I want to make sure to give plenty of time for everyone to join. Okay, one quick final announcement before we go ahead and get started with the panel. For anybody who's just straggled in the last couple minutes, we want to make sure if you're media and you would like to ask questions that you please rename yourself in the Zoom meeting so that we can identify you. To do that, hover your mouse over your own window in the Zoom meeting and click on the little 3-dot menu in the upper right corner that has an option under it for rename. Put your first name, last name, i.e. Clark Kent, the Daily Planet, and that way we'll be able to identify you when we get your questions. And so during this panel, we're going to start right off with a Q&A, no PowerPoints or slideshows or anything like that. It's just questions and answer. And we want you to chat your questions to us. So take note of the chat bubble at the bottom of the Zoom program, and you can chat your questions to us. You can chat them directly to me. If you chat them to everyone in the room, it may generate some discussion among the other attendees, and we welcome that. That would be cool. The other point, though, is that we'd also like to invite you, if you have a question, to go ahead and ask your question yourself on the call. And so if you chat to us, either I or my colleagues, Craig and Jessica, who are helping to moderate the meeting, we'll ask you if you'd like to go ahead and ask the question yourself, and we'll invite you to do so. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to this Newswise Live press event. We have an expert panel today with 5 participants from different universities and other organizations who can talk about the current COVID-19 pandemic and different aspects of that and how it affects daily life around the world. I have here with us today, let me get my list here. We have Doyne Farmer. He's a professor of at the Mathematical Institute at the University of Oxford, and he's also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. We also have Randall Moore. He is the CEO of the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists. We also have Dr. Andrew Barnard. He is from Michigan Tech University. He's the director of the Great Lakes Research Center, and he's also an associate professor of mechanical engineering and engineering mechanics. We have John Wilczynski, who is the executive director of America Makes, and he's also affiliated with the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And we also have Shandy Dirth, lecturer and the director of undergraduate epidemiology education at Indiana University. Thank you very much for all of the experts who have joined today and for our media in attendance. One quick reminder about questions from our media attendees. We'd like to get your questions. Please feel free to send those in as soon as you have questions in mind. Take note of the chat bubble at the bottom of the screen, and you can type your questions to us. When you ask your questions, either I or one of my colleagues, Craig and Jessica, who are helping to moderate the meeting, will invite for you to potentially ask your question live in the meeting. So if you want to equip your audio and or video and ask your questions directly to the expert, we'd welcome that. Of course, I can always just relay those questions for you. And as I have some questions prepared for some of the panelists, I'd like to go ahead and get started. And let's start with you, Professor Dirth, at Indiana. As an epidemiologist, I think that's an important place to start as we talk about the pandemic. What's your assessment of the current level of testing and contact tracing? This is the most important issue, I think, as we've begun to kind of debate nationally whether or not and how to reopen the economy. And I think that that will help to kind of set the framework of how we'll kind of continue talking about this. So tell me, what are we doing with testing, and is it sufficient or not?
So great question. It is improving. I don't think we're there yet. I just saw today that LA announced that they have enough testing now to test anyone, symptomatic or not. So kudos to them. That's great. But unfortunately, many parts of the country are not there yet. So we still need to ramp up available testing. So it's not just for those symptomatic people. It could also be for household contacts and others.
So what else needs to be improved about that situation, and why? What's kind of the basis, for example, testing people who are not currently sick, or maybe were sick and couldn't get tested before, but they want to find out if they did in fact have the coronavirus? Why is this important, and what else needs to be done?
So that's helpful for a couple of reasons. One is it would give us a better idea of just how far the disease had spread before we even knew it was a thing here. So as we've seen, we've now gone back and we found that the disease was here in the US earlier than we originally thought because of some of those coroner reports where they were able to go back and do additional testing and verify it was there. And then the second piece is just to know how many people have been exposed and hopefully are immune going forward. If we were to have a second wave, we're all assuming we will have a second wave. We have not yet verified that having those antibodies means you will be immune, but typically with these kind of diseases, you are. So we're hoping that is the case. We need more data coming in to see that. But again, it would help us plan that next wave. There's a big difference if we have 20% of the country already affected and immune versus 80% of the country. And we just don't have enough testing yet to say which way we are.
And presumably the higher level of people that have been exposed and developed antibodies, the better, the more safe it is to go back out in public.
Correct. It kind of creates that herd immunity that we aim for when we do vaccinations.
And what's the current understanding, as far as you know, of whether those antibodies do mean that a patient is unlikely to get infected again? This was something that was unclear early on, whether a patient could indeed get infected by the virus a second time? Do we know more about that yet?
Well, we're waiting for some results from South Korea because they had mentioned a couple of weeks ago they were starting to see some people who were possibly reinfected, but they weren't sure if those people were truly negative or they just happened to test negative, because these tests are not 100% on accuracy. So additional studies need to follow people, and not just in one country. We would like to see that replicated in several areas just to make sure antibodies really do lead to immunity.
With all this in mind, what's your perspective on how we safely begin to reopen parts of the economy without risking new hotspots emerging and a spike of infections in new areas? What do you think is the right process and policy to follow there?
So I think we need to follow the data and follow the science. Once we really start to see a decline in cases, that's when we can start to move forward. And I think we should do that step by step, wait 2 or 3 weeks between each set of openings to see if we are seeing increases. A big thing I'm hearing right now is as these businesses are starting to open, they're not able to secure masks and PPE that they might need. And we need to do some education also around what kind of cleaning might need to be done in public places, because we didn't have a chance to do a lot of that yet before we went ahead and started shutting things down across the country.
Thank you, Professor Durf. I want to go ahead to Professor Farmer and talk a little bit more about this possibility of reopening the economy. And Professor Farmer, you've done some study about the current numbers and made some projections for how bad or how severe the recession may be. What does your study predict? Are we looking at a few quarters of recession potentially, or something longer and a more full-on year or more depression?
Well, I think the thing that's clear is for a couple of quarters, things are quite bad. And so that's deep. You know, we're predicting, and actually our predictions are pretty much borne out. The order of 25% of workers in the economy are in danger of losing their jobs. Even if they don't lose them, they're not able to work productively during lockdown. The big question is what happens when you let the lockdown off? That it's not very clear, because the US, unfortunately, is following the strategy of firing people. And I mean, letting people be fired and then giving them support. And this frightening statistic is that the Great Depression, which had levels that if you annualize stuff match what we're going to get in the first 2 quarters, Great Depression lasted for a decade. And why did it last for a decade? Because, you know, supply depends on demand and demand depends on supply. So you've got to have people with money to buy stuff, to make stuff, to employ people, to have people with money. And so the question is, how long will it take to rehire everybody and realign the economy as we come out? Already there's problems just coordinating the supply chains as you try and come out of a lockdown. And so the worry is that, I guess the way we think about it, there's going to be some mixture of a V-shaped recovery where we come out, we go down really hard, and then we come back up. And an L-shaped recovery where we go down and we don't come back up. And the big question is, what fraction of those 2 scenarios are we going to see? Because I'd be very surprised if we don't see a couple of years of reduced output afterwards. But that's the part, frankly, that's the hardest to predict, and we can't really say. And I don't think anybody else can right now.
Digging a little bit further on that, are there certain sectors of the economy that may be able to experience a more V-shaped recovery while others looks more L or U-shaped?
Yeah. So it's pretty clear that some sectors like manufacturing should be able to come back fairly quickly, particularly with revised procedures and masks and cleaning and all that kind of stuff. The bigger challenge are consumer-facing industries. And one of the questions is, when you come out, how different will the slope be than it was as we were going in? Because, you know, as we were in the early days of the epidemic, the doubling time was about 3 days. And on the other hand, if you look at Japan, the doubling time was much slower. Why? Well, presumably because Japanese don't shake hands, don't hug, they wear masks if they get sick. And so it was a long, steady exponential decrease, but in a much slower slope. So let's hope that we can at least achieve Japan coming out. And particularly if we selectively open manufacturing and other industries that don't involve a lot of face-to-face contact or don't involve interactions with consumers, and then hold off on the more consumer-oriented industries.
You compared the current crisis a little bit to the Great Depression, which has some good historical analogs, although it was a different time with different technology and different levels of international integration, globalization. What can we learn from the Great Depression, though, that does apply well to this current crisis? And maybe another more recent example, the 2008 housing crash and the resulting economic crisis at that time, that's much more fresh in our memories. How do both of these examples give us a clue about what to expect now?
Well, I don't think the difference in technology makes that much difference, because the Great Depression was very basic economics, as Keynes originally intuited, this feedback loop between supply and demand getting stuck at a low level, because if you have a lot of unemployed people, they don't spend much. If they don't spend much, people don't make much, which means they don't hire much, which means they don't spend much. And we just got stuck for a decade in that kind of trap. And so one big difference this time, because people get that, is that at least a lot of money is being pumped back into the economy. I don't think it's being pumped back in the most efficient way. I think a lot of the European countries are doing a better job in the way they're delivering the funds. But at least everybody understands that. They realize you really have to reprime the pump once you shut it down. Otherwise, the pump never pumps well again. And so that's the most important lesson. Before the Depression, the world was surprisingly international, actually. And one of the things that happened during the Depression is that changed. International trade went way down during the Depression. And some people worry that that was one of the reasons it sustained for so long. What finally got us out of it was World War II. And let's hope we don't have to go there this time.
And what can we learn about the recovery from the 2008 crisis? This is only maybe 4 or 5 years that we've gotten back to the levels that we dropped from.
So the 2008 crisis was different in two key ways. One is that the 2008 crisis was what I would call an endogenous event to the economy. I mean, we got way over leveraged. People didn't understand mortgage-backed securities. Their positions were all way too big. It was driven by the financial system, and it was driven by the financial system acting on itself. This one is coming from outside. We have a pandemic. The pandemic hits the real economy, and then the real economy is going to transmit back to the financial system. So whereas in the 2008 crisis, it started with the financial system and then reverberated back to the real economy, it's going the other direction this time. And that's actually kind of unusual. Now, the good news is historically, depressions or recessions that are driven by the real economy are not as bad as the ones that are driven by the financial system. Somehow the financial system, there's a different loop we get stuck in. We're way over leveraged. Everybody's borrowing too much money. And then they go, oh my God, things are dangerous. And then everybody sells. And then there's not enough leverage and businesses can't operate because they can't borrow money anymore. And then you get stuck in some mode like that for a long time. So I think one of the main lessons is, I think everybody agrees in hindsight that, again, if it hadn't been for the really aggressive action that the government took, I mean, we had Ben Bernanke as head of the Federal Reserve. He was a depression scholar. He knew we really have to go after this one. And while I think, again, they could have delivered the stimulus more effectively from the bottom instead of the top, we might have a lot fewer problems with dissatisfaction about the system if they'd given the money to householders instead of the banks. But nonetheless, everybody pretty much agrees that a big stimulus was essential, and that message is coming through this time. And so that's probably the most important thing.
Great. Thank you, Professor Farmer. I want to go next to Randall Moore at AANA. Your members, your constituents are frontline medical workers. Nurse anesthetists are being redeployed to work in ICUs and all kinds of other tasks. Tell us about the strain on the healthcare system and what's your sense of that? while both the pandemic and the pressures of dealing with that, but also the closing or the halting of other types of routine medical care, your members are kind of caught in a little bit of a bind there. Tell us what we need to understand about that.
Yeah, when you think about the impact of COVID-19 on the healthcare system, it's especially cruel phenomenon, because you're looking at a precipitous decline in elective care, right? So, and you're seeing hospitals and health systems realizing right now 75 to 80% decline in their revenue. And many of those hospitals, particularly in the rural areas of this country, were already in a very precarious financial position, right? So many of them were in the red or just barely in the black. And then you add in a precipitous decline in their revenue, we're seeing some really scary things happen, right? And we're seeing hospitals close, some of which will reopen. And so, there's that. And then that's coupled with a profound increase in patients, COVID-19 patients in metropolitan areas in particular, but now it's starting to move out into the rural areas and the community-based hospitals. And that's increasing resulting in an increased demand in care. So it really is a particularly cruel crisis in that the revenue stream has been almost completely eliminated, and then the demand is is increased precipitously in some areas, and it's created an enormous strain on the financial stability of healthcare in this country.
Tell us about the status currently of PPE and other types of equipment shortages and how that's been handled. Are health systems finding ways to source the equipment that they need, and what else do you think needs to be done?
Well, the challenge is that it's highly variable. It depends on who you talk to. And I think this, when we hopefully get on the other end of this crisis, and we do in the military what we call an after-action review, we'll identify some opportunities here, particularly around supply chain constraints. And so right now, still, we're almost 7 weeks into this crisis, and we still have areas of this country, hospitals and clinics and nursing homes competing with each other for PPE, and then competing with states for PPE, and then the states are competing with the federal government. And it goes on and on and on. And you can see, the challenges there, right? And I can give you an example of what this means in real life for a real, a clinician in the trenches right now. Just last week, I spoke to a nurse anesthetist in a well-known health system in this country who's been using the same N95 mask for a month. So those masks are manufactured to be single use only. You use it, you throw it away. She's been using the same one for a month. And, she's not an anomaly, right? There are healthcare providers all across this country having to make do with an inadequate supply. Some health systems and hospitals and clinics are just fine. Many are not, and many of them are just fine right now. But if they experience a surge, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later on, if there's subsequent surges or waves, they could be in a lot of trouble. So still, today, 6 to 7 weeks into this crisis, we still have some very serious issues with supply chain.
Thank you for shedding some light on that. I want to go ahead to John Wilczynski with America Makes, as they're working really hard with the team of engineers to work together with healthcare leaders to figure out ways of improving that supply chain. John, what can you tell us about how America Works and the ASME are working together to bring these kind of tech experts into the fight?
Yep, absolutely. So Randall very clearly just documented where we're at with things. It's really why we got engaged, going on 7 weeks ago. We represent a community of manufacturers, in the additive manufacturing or 3D printed space. There is a belief that there's opportunity for that technology to supplement or potentially bridge supply chain gaps. So that's how we got involved. And, one thing we found immediately was there's a tremendous interest in supporting those frontline workers, but there wasn't a lot of organization around how to do that effectively. Many of the folks in our community aren't familiar with working underneath regulatory requirements of the FDA and healthcare system. So there was a lot of information and knowledge sharing required in order for folks to be able to support the needs. So we teamed up very early on with a group of federal organizations from the FDA, VA, and NIH to build a process or a workflow where those that had ideas for how they could supplement the supply chain in some way could produce designs that ultimately would be vetted such that manufacturers would know where to go to produce an item that could be delivered to the front line. And that all obviously depends a lot on criticality of use and where it's going to be used and what type of item it is. But it's somewhere where we've seen the technology step up and play a key role in some cases just retooling a line, which is very important. So that we've seen many manufacturers in injection molding lines and more conventional manufacturing processes retool such that they could produce these parts. In some cases, we used additive or 3D printing to bridge a gap, and maybe we're now over some of those hurdles, although as just documented, we're hearing some of those same stories. The demand signal has been difficult to understand. We go and day to day, it would change so dramatically. And then when you talk to some frontline workers, you realize some of that's because they're being forced to use PPE items for weeks, whereas normally they would replace those multiple times per day. So it's really hard to predict a demand signal, which ultimately makes it difficult for the supply chain to understand whether a small manufacturer or a Fortune 50 manufacturer to know where they can step up. And we've dealt with the entire spectrum there. Ultimately, we're in the position where we're trying to build a more resilient supply chain. That's what we all understand we need to have. There's been a lot of progress made. We're seeing a lot of conventional manufacturing be repurposed or kind of retrofitted right now. So you've seen a lot of those stories. So that is reassuring, and hopefully that is now starting to get to the point where some of that PPE is making its way to the front line, so that we stop hearing those stories of reuse over lengthy amounts of time.
With a lot of these engineers and the industry partners being from other industries, not necessarily having experience in medical device manufacturing, how are you guys helping to translate these kind of complicated issues and getting these new participants up to speed with important things like just following the right procedures, testing, safety, and getting FDA approval and things like that?
Yep, no, absolutely. So we've learned a lot really quickly. We've talked to a lot of folks and experts in these spaces who deal with these types of scenarios. We've come out, and through some of the work that we've done with NIH, created a portal where folks can access designs, but it's really about information sharing. So we've built something that internally we call the Rosetta Stone, but it's really about how does a manufacturer come to a place to understand. They all want to get engaged, but in some cases they don't know what they can and cannot do. So we're trying to lower those barriers to entry, make sure they understand any regulatory concerns. They need to have GMP, a term I didn't even know what that meant, a couple of months ago, around different quality systems that they need to have in place. So we're trying to make that as transparent as possible, so someone can very quickly come to a location, determine where they can get involved, and then go do good. And I think that's proven to be successful. We heard some stories of where material wasn't able to be utilized because people weren't following the right process. And
Right.
There's little details like that where, even in times of dire need, you have to make sure you're checking the right boxes, because we don't want to, and most importantly, we want to deliver safe, effective products. That's what this all should be about. So we're trying to help the community come together. And there's a number of organizations. There's been, I've been involved in many different get-togethers through ASME and other standards organizations to get the manufacturing community to understand what they can do and where they should be involved.
Thank you, John. I want to turn next to an example from an engineer with Professor Bernard at Michigan Tech. Andrew, you worked on developing something here. I'm going to share an image of it so people can get an idea. Repurposing an old shipping container and equipping it with the means. I hope that picture's showing for everyone. Equipping it with the means to sanitize equipment through exposing it to high heat. Tell us about this project, how it originated, and any more info about what this kind of innovation means for bringing engineers into this fight, as John has described.
Sure, thank you. We really set out to try to address the need that both Randall and John have mentioned in PPE shortages. And one way to help our frontline healthcare workers is to provide some semblance of decontamination between reuses of PPE, even though the PPE is not made for that. Can we do something that's better than hanging your PPE overnight in a paper bag, which is what's currently going on? And sort of the idea started really with a call between my cousin and I, and he's an organic farmer. We were chatting about box trucks and insulated containers, and started thinking about, all right, well, can we convert rapidly available materials like insulated trucks into something very quickly that can be used in the fight to help our frontline healthcare workers? So we came up with the idea for our mobile thermal utility sanitizer. There's lots of different sanitizing or decontaminating methods out there. We chose to go with thermal because it's very rapid to manufacture, it's relatively inexpensive, and the parts are available. So you don't have to have a PhD or an MD to design and make these units. You got to be good at HVAC and have an electrician on board. So we also wanted to make something that was scalable and large enough that could really help in emergency situations. So something bigger than, say, just using your kitchen oven is what we were after. It turns out a 40-foot shipping container works really well for this. We can sanitize about 5,000 N95 masks in a 2-hour period, so 60 to 80,000 masks a day. And we designed and built that unit, our first unit, in 8 days. So I think it goes to show, what engineers and universities can bring to the table in an event like this, where time is of the essence.
And you built this and conceived of it deliberately as a plan that could easily be replicated and shared with health systems and state agencies, and even I believe you told me that you've got the prototype now with the National Guard. Tell me about how that, as kind of a format or a template for this project, of wanting it to be something that you achieve the prototype, but then share the design freely and hope that it can be utilized.
Yeah, that's exactly where we started on this project. And we wanted to make something that, if the plans were available, any small manufacturing house in any part of the country could make it in a matter of days. And that's a real challenge because usually engineers make these very complicated systems that require specialized manufacturing in order to build. And we intentionally went after things that could be bought on basically the residential do-it-yourselfer can have access to with 1 or 2 day shipping in order to build this. For those of you that aren't familiar with where Michigan Tech is, Houghton, Michigan is in the Upper Peninsula. And what we like to say, if we can get it in Houghton in 2 days, you can get it anywhere else in the country in 1, because we're about as far as you're going to get. So we really, really intentionally worked with available residential grade parts to try to make an inexpensive but safe system that can be used for our healthcare workers.
Thank you, Professor. I want to go back to Professor Dearth for some more about the progress of this pandemic, and especially further on the debate about reopening the economy. And I want to ask you if you think that there's any concern about there being a false sense of security in some parts of the country, in less densely populated areas or more rural states, because they've not yet seen these high levels of infections that we're seeing in New York being the epicenter. But that doesn't mean it won't come to those places, correct? That's
correct. So it's possible that we shut down the country early enough that it had not spread to those very rural areas in a serious situation. The more we test, the more we're finding it, obviously. But another concern in another wave where these areas are hit, again, maybe we don't have as many people who already had a past exposure and may have built immunity. But also, as noted earlier, a lot of our rural residents rely on these larger city urban hospitals who have already had first big hit. And so we really want to contain that and make sure that we don't have that second hit until we have more PPE available. It sounds like it's still very much a problem, even in many healthcare settings around the country.
And what concerns do you have about this notion of reopening, easing restrictions, and then that resulting in new hotspots and that kind of false start leading to a second wave? We've talked a lot about that with some of our economics experts that have been on recent panels, and the cost of that to the economy. How would that impact the healthcare system in general? And as an epidemiologist, why is that a concern?
I mean, obviously that surge just means we have fewer people available to treat people for other issues going on. And so we're getting to that point in this pandemic now that some things that may have not been so urgent 6, 7, 8 weeks ago are becoming urgent for some of these patients, not related to coronavirus. So we need a safe way to get those patients into medical care when needed while still protecting the PPE supply.
Thank you, Professor. I want to ask Randy, what lessons do you think that there have been in this crisis so far as it's unfolded about preparation and leadership? With this being something that there was a lot of unclear info early on and maybe contradictory statements and advice coming out of different places. It's been confusing. It's been challenging. Looking back, what maybe could have been done better, and what did we learn for the next time?
Well, a few things that come to mind. One is, clearly the leaders in this country at the state and the local and even the federal level who moved decisively early made the right call, right? And that's one of the challenges is when you have incomplete data set and you're having to make difficult decisions. It appears now, at least, that those who moved aggressively probably saved a lot of people's lives. The other piece about this that is really important, and hopefully, again, another lesson that's learned is the inadequate infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure in this country to deal with the public health crisis is, I think, abundantly clear to me, at least, right? I mean, we've already talked about the supply chain issues, the decentralized nature of healthcare in this country, the competition between facilities, and all of those things indicate to me that this pandemic has uncovered. And we already knew that, we had challenges in healthcare delivery in this country. I think this pandemic has uncovered a lot more, and that those challenges are probably a lot worse than what we thought they were. And we certainly were not prepared. I don't think any country's ever fully prepared to deal with a novel virus pandemic, right? But if you look at how we responded, there's some things we did well, and there's certainly some things that we didn't do particularly well.
You called out some states that did decisive action early on, and that's been effective. I think parts of California have been held up as examples for that. For example, we've got cases where other states are, in some people's minds, rushing to reopen, and that has its own risks with it. So that's kind of the flip side of that. What are your concerns about a kind of state by state process for this, and the kind of laissez-faire attitude of the federal government of allowing the states to make up their minds about this themselves? Why does that concern you?
Yeah, we're currently embarking on a high-stakes experiment right now in terms of how states individually and in some cases collectively are approaching reopening the economies within their states, right? So Georgia is obviously the example that many people point to, where they close late and they appear to be, by many people's definition, opening early. And even if you look at the criteria that were established by the White House in terms of how you reopen, Georgia meets none of those criteria. So now they're opening up, and we're going to see what the consequences of that are going to be from an economic perspective, but more importantly, from a public health perspective. So my fear is that they open up, that they experience a significant surge in patients who are COVID-19 positive. It creates a profound strain on the healthcare facilities in that state. People die that probably should not have died because of the strain on resources. And those facilities and that state is unprepared for what's coming its way, potentially.
Thank you, Randy. To Professor Farmer, as we talk more about what factors go into and what policy goes into the idea of reopening the economy, what are your thoughts, economically speaking, on these kind of state-by-state decisions, and even internationally, nation by nation, different cases? We've heard a lot. South Korea has done a good job. They're back to a certain level that maybe other areas are not ready for. What are your thoughts about that and how that affects the global economy?
Well, I think, you know, the best way to get the economy going is to deal with the epidemic quickly and effectively. And we see that most of these Eastern countries have done a pretty good job in that regard. In contrast, Europe's done a fairly good job. They started too late. The UK in particular started about 2 or 3 weeks after everybody thought they should have. But at least they all have coordinated lockdown policies and minimal flow now across national borders. The US, you know, you can drive from anywhere to anywhere anytime you feel like it. And you open some states up and you close other parts down, and it's going to be chaos, and it's going to prolong the epidemic, in my opinion, for a long time, because and in the end, it's going to be economically unproductive. So my prediction is that when the dust settles, the US is going to hit harder, both in terms of number of deaths and in terms of economics, than any of the other developed countries, because of the incoherent public health policies that we've implemented.
Thank you, Professor Farmer. John, I'd like to ask you about some of the projects that America Works is collaborating on. And do you have examples or some more ideas that you can share about the kinds of designs and prototypes that you've helped to, say, take a design that wasn't quite ready and help to improve it, or fast tracking ones that had promise? And what can you share with us about that? Other kinds of novel challenges as well, besides just PPE. That's been one that the public largely, I think, grasps, masks and face shields, but there might be other things too that you've come across and that you could share with us.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you actually kind of hit on it when you asked Randy a question a second ago. You know, early on, there was a lot of bad information out there. So we worked together to try to get that information organized. And we have a process, as I mentioned, for submitting designs into a system. They get flagged as prototypes, and then they get reviewed, evaluated, and then they ultimately can be released per, you know, our collection of organizations, the VA, FDA, and NIH, as, you know, okay for community use, or okay for use in a clinical setting. So we've seen a number of, I mean, we have almost 500 designs submitted to the site, the NIH site, the 3D Print Exchange right now. And many of those, you know, a lot of the folks who are designing these items aren't typically designing items for use in a healthcare setting. So there's been iteration, there's been feedback and back and forth between those evaluating. Early on, we focused on face shields. It's something that you can very quickly and easily get out, but it was also a critical need. We've moved past that to face masks are certainly a big need right now. And as more folks are going back to work, that becomes an even greater need. We're trying to, you know, make sure N95s are available where they're needed, and then use, you know, other means for portions of the populations that don't ultimately need that same protection. Additive manufacturing has the potential to play a role. We're actually finding, though, in the, you know, 100 plus or almost 200 different designs that we have, there's still a problem with fit. So they don't seal. So even if it's a great design, if you have big gaps around it, it's not doing its job ultimately. So we just launched something called the Fit to Face Challenge with the VA. And we're currently reviewing and down selecting designs, ultimately, you know, trying to fit as large a portion of the population as possible. You know, a couple of other interesting things going on, and this is all really about getting the community. So I've mentioned it, others have mentioned it. Everyone wants to help. We need to make sure they're focused. So one way we're trying to focus people is to not make the 50th version of something that's already been, you know, viewed as acceptable, but to move on and focus to something else. So we teamed up with a group called Challenge America. We're currently in the midst of a active challenge with them. They're actually having something called a hack or a make-a-thon this weekend, where they're getting virtual teams together to address a challenge space. And the challenge space for this weekend is that of first responders. So we recognize there's specific needs of that community that COVID is now presenting that we're not really very well aware of. So we want to make sure that we're addressing it. So this weekend on Saturday and Sunday, there'll be groups of people coming together to try to address those challenges. And then we're planning on, through this relationship with the VA and Challenge America, continuing to do this every few weeks on the next, on a new challenge space. So the next one that we're focusing on that was identified was, kind of the role of sanitation worker, recognizing that as more and more people get back to work, there's going to be an extreme focus on that job description that maybe there hasn't been in the past. So what are the things that the sanitation, community can benefit from by coming up with new designs? Again, all about focusing on how can we help and just not spinning our wheels doing the same thing we've already figured out.
Thank you, John. I want to ask Professor Bernard, again, talking about a very specific example of the decontamination unit that you created. What's next for your project in terms of approval by the FDA? What's happening with the prototype that you've created? And how are you navigating this environment that John's described, where engineers need to follow the right protocols?
Yeah, that's been a big learning experience for us. I'm a mechanical engineer who runs the Great Lakes Research Center. I've never done anything in the healthcare sector. So trying to understand FDA approval is a whole new world for me and for many on our team. We're currently going through the FDA emergency use authorization process, which is an iterative process with the FDA. So they send us questions, we answer those questions. They send us more questions, we answer those questions, back and forth until eventually they tell us yes or no. We're still in that process. Our unit is deployed with the Michigan Army National Guard. We were lucky enough to have the governor agree that it was important enough technology that the National Guard should be running it. So we were given a contingent of 9 soldiers who we were able to train here on campus. And then they took the unit down to Taylor Armory, which is just north of Detroit. And they are awaiting an opportunity to go and use that unit. We have several healthcare facilities interested, but not willing to start using it until the FDA EUA is issued. So that's really the step we're at right now, is waiting for that EUA.
Very good. Tell me also what plans, if you have any, to continue to develop this prototype and make further enhancements to it for a second generation of it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So our device is a dry heat device, which is really the least effective of the decontamination methods, but the easiest to access, which is why we started there. Our second generation device, which was just completed a couple days ago by our industrial partner, is a moist heat device. So it actually has humidity control as well as temperature, which allows us to more effectively kill things beyond viruses like bacterial spores and other things that are also a risk of spreading around in hospitals. So we're really excited about that technology as well. And we're looking at, based on feedback from the FDA, how we develop our procedures and our protocols so that our devices can be used safely in a hospital environment.
Thank you, Professor. If any of the media in attendance have any questions, please do chat them to us. You can see the chat bubble at the bottom of the screen. You can chat to me. We'll invite you if you'd like to ask your question live to the panel, or I will relay the question for you. Back to Professor Dearth again for some more about the medical and epidemiology questions. Can you explain to us what the federal guidance really says about state policy for reopening and lifting these restrictions?
Sure. So they've outlined a few guidelines. One says that you have to have good contact tracing in place. It says that you have to have good testing in place. There aren't a lot of very specific elements around those items, though. And then you have to have a decline in the percent of cases that are positive. So as we do more testing, we're going to find more cases. So in many areas, the case counts continue to go up, but that's probably a factor of just having better testing, not that we are necessarily having more transmission go on. But that's where they're focusing on that percentage. And I can say lots of places have seen that leveled off. We're not seeing a big decline yet. So we're not there quite yet. So as you said earlier, most places have not reached those federal guidelines that they've set.
I'm curious about one point you made there about more thorough testing, not necessarily meaning that there's been a change in the number of transmissions. And this feels like something that's been really at the heart of this whole crisis. Whether we test people who are symptomatic and when they come to the hospital versus contact tracing and more widespread testing for people who might have been at risk or might have already been sick and gotten over it. Why is this so complicated? Why is this difficult to understand? Does it have a lot to do with the fact that there are asymptomatic cases, or why else, from your perspective, can we not truly pin down what's the transmissibility rate?
Well, that's a big piece of it. And early on, as you know, we had very limited testing. So we had to reserve those very precious tests that we did have for the healthcare workers, because we know we don't want a healthcare worker sick, working, infecting other people in a hospital where you've got the most vulnerable populations going. And then as the testing has improved, we're seeing that we're seeing the numbers of how many people are truly asymptomatic. So we're doing those questionnaires. If you were positive, but you don't report any symptoms in the past, then we know that's been a problem.
Thank you so much for clarifying that for us. With the possibility of testing for antibodies, this is post-infection. What does that tell us that's worthwhile, and why does that matter?
Again, it goes back to two factors. One is how well was the disease transmitted earlier on? How long was this really in the country? How far was the geographic spread? And then for the second future possible wave, how many people might have immunity?
Gotcha. Not to share too much personal information, but I had a really terrible cold in late January, and I've been suspicious. Maybe it was the disease, and I'd like to get tested to know or not, especially because I have a family member who's got kind of some high risk issues, and I would know whether it was safe to go visit or not. Do you see that this will be something that is more accessible in the near future, or is that still facing a lot of complications?
We're getting there. I know a lot of the larger cities are offering more of the antibody testing. A lot of universities have stepped up and actually been able to develop that test themselves. So all of that work is not put on the CDC labs and the state public health labs.
Understood. Okay. If any of the media have further questions for any of our panelists, please do share them. I'd like to go back to Randy Moore. Randy, beyond PPE, what other kind of equipment shortages or other resources that are facing risks looming on the horizon? Is there an issue with certain kinds of medicine, for example, running low?
Yeah, we're certainly very concerned about drug shortages, and we're starting to experience that already. As you know, the drug supply chain is pretty inflexible, right? And and we're seeing a high utilization of drugs associated with treating critically ill patients, right? So, and we also know that COVID-19 patients, the ones that become really, really sick, are on ventilators for prolonged periods of time. So you're talking about medications like, narcotics and sedatives, muscle relaxants. We think there's a very real possibility that we're going to be experiencing some pretty significant shortages moving forward. So we're working very closely with the FDA and with facilities and other agencies to try to understand how we can conserve these medications in a way so we don't deplete them prematurely. So certainly that's something that we should all, I think that's that next shoe that's going to drop in terms of, okay, now what are we going to do with this new sub-crisis associated with the pandemic? I still, weeks ago, I was very concerned about the ventilators. And that was one of those things that was keeping me up at night, based on some of the modeling that I was seeing and the utilization that was occurring and the lack of supply that appeared to be unavailable at that time. I'm becoming less concerned now, but again, if we experience another wave, right? If in the fall, in the winter, or certain areas of this country can experience surges, there's still a very real possibility that we could have challenges with ventilators moving forward. And then I guess the third resource that is not getting a lot of attention is really the providers, right? The people who are in the facilities taking care of these patients day in and day out. You know, the clinicians, the housekeepers, they're experiencing immense strain, right? Psychological, physical strain as a result of taking care of these critically ill patients for a prolonged period of time. And I would like to see more conversations about the psychological trauma associated with that. And what are we going to do in this country to address that? Because I think that's going to be another element in the coming weeks and months that it is going to be really difficult to deal with.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. And that's a topic that we've had panelists on in recent weeks to talk about some of those mental health issues. And we're currently talking with another of our members about having more of that. So that's well noted. Thank you. I want to ask real quick if you could tell us a little bit more about what your AANA members are doing in terms of being redeployed to other areas, and especially if there's policy that could be improved to make redeploying CRNAs more effective to solve some of these problems that have been highlighted by this crisis.
Sure. So if you look at the background and the education and the training of a nurse anesthetist, it's almost as if they were ideally positioned to be involved in responding to this crisis. One is we have a background as critical care nurses, right? Before we go to anesthesia school, we're critical care nurses, and then we go into anesthesia school, and we're advanced practice nurses that have deep expertise in managing patients' airways, right? So we know that 12 to 13% of COVID-19 patients require tracheal intubation, putting a breathing tube in, and mechanical ventilation. We are experts, airway experts, and we're highly involved in taking care of patients who require mechanical ventilation. We manage critically ill patients with vasoactive drugs and a variety of other clinical interventions that occur in the critical care space. So what's been remarkable is that's not the role that we traditionally play, right? Nurse anesthetists and anesthesiologists usually are not in critical care units taking care of pandemic patients, but we've been redeployed in those areas in many cases, and there's all kinds of stories, of how we've stepped up and contributed. There is, again, in this country, there still remains a lot of challenges relative to advanced practice providers that are not physicians. And I'm talking about, antiquated state laws, rules, regulations that really prohibit nurse anesthetists, nurse practitioners, physician assistants from practicing to the top of their education and training. And what has been interesting to see is at both the state and federal level, all of a sudden those rules are gone. There's a crisis, and all of a sudden we've become a lot smarter and a lot more capable, and we've stepped up and we've been able to make major contributions. So, the work that we're doing at both the state and national level is let's get rid of these barriers now during a pandemic, and let's get rid of the barriers permanently. Because we know pre-COVID, there was a huge access to care and cost issue with healthcare in this country. That's not going to go away. In fact, it's going to be worse after COVID-19.
After COVID-19, question from the chat on this topic: how might emergency care change? Randy, what can you tell us about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, emergency care. One is I'd call out is this disease has only been in existence for a few months, so we still know very little about it, which is scary and which makes it particularly dangerous. I think some of the things that we've learned is that, one, you need to move decisively. Two, you need to make sure that you have the resources available within your facilities. Just-in-time supply chain has not worked when it comes to a pandemic where you're using, the burn rate for PPE is just, it's through the roof, right? So we now know that the national stockpile didn't work in terms of the number of ventilators and PPE. So we need to be very serious about making sure that we have adequate supply. So I think that's one of the things that, is particularly illuminating for me is we need to be very cognizant of the supplies that we need in order to respond to these kinds of health crises, which we did not see coming, right? In November and December, this was not on our radar, or at least not in a real way. So I think those are some of the lessons that I've learned.
Thank you, Randy. That question from Deb Wood with Nurse Zone. I want to go to Professor Farmer for a few final questions about some economic topics. And again, after COVID-19, as we had the last question, what do you see as obstacles to this economic recovery that will make the difference between parts of the economy that might be more V-shaped versus L or U-shaped? What are some of those obstacles? Which industries might be in the mix for that quicker recovery versus the longer one, and why? Let's make sure your audio is on.
Manufacturing type industries will get back to work soon. We'll be able to make stuff fairly soon. But restaurants, airlines, vacations, those kind of industries are going to probably take a long time before they get back to normal, because until we have a vaccine and really wipe the disease out, it could be a year or two before people are comfortable going. So I think common sense kind of tells you the key part in that.
What myths or misinformation have you seen about the economic effects that you'd like to address?
Well, there's a couple of things that people don't realize, like getting sick isn't just about getting sick yourself. It's about keeping the virus alive to make other people sick. So it's really a matter of citizen duty to not get sick. I think a lot of young people have been a bit irresponsible about that, or in some states where people don't understand those kind of issues. And obviously there's been huge amounts of misinformation in various parts of the media and social networks about conspiracy theories about, the virus being the result of leakage from the lab or stuff like that. There's just a lot of silly stories floating around.
Thank you, Professor Farmer. We have a couple questions from some of the media in attendance that I think are best for Professor Dearth. We'll try to wrap up with a couple questions here as we are about at an hour. First, we have Yasmin Rasidi, who has a question. Go ahead, Yasmin.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask about how effective the lockdown is in decreasing the COVID-19 infection rates. Like, that some of the countries have imposed lockdown, either like full lockdown like Italy, Spain, or maybe like partial like Singapore, and how effective is lockdown in lowering or flattening the curve. And about the economic impact, what do you think governments around the world can do to mitigate the economic impact of lockdown, and which countries are more vulnerable to recession? As if I'm not mistaken, I read that US and Singapore's recession are worse than estimate. And how severe is the recession compared to Asian financial crisis in 1997-98 and global financial crisis in 2008? Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. So first, Professor Dearth on the lockdown and the infection rates, and then to Professor Farmer for the economic questions.
Sure. I think had we not locked down, it would have been catastrophic. I think locking down was the right thing to do. Knowing that people show symptoms sometimes up to 14 days after exposure, we were able to look at when things were locked down, and we were able to see the cases start to decrease coming into the hospitals, emergency departments, and so on. So I think it's been very effective, and we'll need to do it again in a second wave if we do have that.
And Professor Farmer on the economic questions about which countries' policies have been most effective and which are maybe at most risk for severe recessions.
Well, I'll boost what Shandy says. Just look across the countries, and it's very clear. The countries that imposed early strong lockdowns, got rid of it quickly, and their economies are functioning just fine. Vietnam, no deaths. New Zealand's reopened. They're having, a few infections per day. Most of the Eastern countries have done far better. India being an unfortunate example in the other direction. But no, I think it's very clear that economically, locking down early and hard is far and away the best way to go from a death and an economic point of view. And somehow it's like politicians weren't paying close enough attention, because by the time we got to the US, there was plenty of warning. All you had to do was compare what's happened in the countries across the world. It just seemed like a no-brainer.
Thank you, Professor. Another question from Carlin Hultgren, who is with the Porch Press. She's the East Atlanta editor. Carlin, would you like to ask your question?
Oh. Sorry, I lost you there.
Your audio is live, Carlin, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
It is. Okay. I did taken off my picture while I was eating lunch.
No problem.
Yeah. I was just once I'm in Georgia, so there's not a lot of widespread testing. Once we get to that point where there is widespread testing, does that mean for everyone? Does it mean just for vulnerable populations still? How does that manifest itself? And, to what end, if you will, what's the best case scenario? Let's put it that way.
Thank you. I think Professor Dearth is best to answer this one.
So that's a great question. I've got to say, we are so far away from having enough widespread testing. I've not even heard that question asked yet. So that's a great one. I would say we might get to the point where we've got a vaccine before we have enough tests for everyone. And even if you've already had it, if you were to be vaccinated, there's no harm in being vaccinated for disease that you've already had in the past. So I would think that they'll just kind of not give up on testing, but they won't necessarily recommend testing before you get a vaccine would be my guess. But again, I have not been a part of those conversations.
Thank you for your question, Carlin. Professor Dearth, what, if any, misinformation or myths have you seen recently that you think are especially important to address?
I don't know so much about a myth, but one piece of education we need to get out there is that in March, when we first started shutting down things, the U.S. Poison Control Centers announced through CDC that they had seen an uptick in the number of people with problems mixing chlorine, ammonia, other chemicals that should not be mixed. And so my concern, I know some cities were reporting an uptick again last week after some misinformation got into the news. My concern is that as things start to reopen over this next month and businesses are trying to do their best to clean and sanitize areas, that we're going to see some more of those accidents happen. And actually HHS, I believe, just gave an allotment of money to the U.S. Poison Control Centers and CDC to do some additional public education around that topic.
Thank you, Professor Dearth. I believe if we don't have any more questions from media, we're at an hour. We'll go ahead and draw to a close. I want to thank John Wilczynski from America Makes, not America Works. Sorry about that, John. America Makes. We also have Randall Moore from the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists, Shandy Dearth from Indiana University, Andrew Bernard from Michigan Technological University, and Doyne Farmer from Oxford University and Santa Fe Institute. Thank you all very much to our panelists for joining. For media who are in the call, we're going to provide a video of today's event as well as a transcript. And if you registered for today's event, you'll be on the list to receive that once we have that information available. If you're in the call and you didn't register, you can just shoot us a quick email to info@newswise.com and we'll get you on the list to receive that information. With that, we'll go ahead and close. Thank you so much again to the panelists and for the media attending. Stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy and good luck.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.